Welcome to your podcast on symbiosis. This is a really cool area to talk about. I'm pretty excited because I get to talk about parasites. Symbiosis, you might know, is basically, it just means living together, and it's describing when two species have some sort of connection and sometimes are dependent upon each other. When we say symbiosis, I imagine many of you are thinking where two species benefit each other, but symbiosis has a broader meaning than that. In fact, there's three types of symbiosis. One of them is parasitism, parasites, right? Other is commensalism, and the last is mutualism. Now, in reversed order, mutualism is what you're probably thinking of, where you have a mutual benefit to both species. Commensalism is where one's benefited and the other isn't affected, and of course, parasitism is where one's benefit and the other is actually harmed. So let's start by talking about one of my favorite examples. Right here you have a picture of a nematode, and this is an unsegmented worm, a very, very small worm, and there's a vast variety of nematodes doing all sorts of things in the world, in water, in soil, sometimes living in organisms like this guy. There's actually a fairly famous nematode that lives right here in Carpinteria down in the salt marsh, and it actually moves from snail to fish to bird, causing behavioral and physical changes in those organisms as the nematode moves from one to the other. And each of those host organisms is an important part of its life cycle, and the nematode has a big effect on those species and then the entire ecosystem. So these are very integrated parts of life cycles and ecosystems. There's a very famous single-celled protozoan that has a major effect on actually the behavior of larger animals. Its primary host, or one of its primary hosts, is rodents, and it actually causes rodents, it does a little brain chemistry, and causes rodents to be sexually attracted to cat urine. Some studies say it's just not afraid of cat urine anymore, but either way, you can imagine what happens to the rodents. So this protozoan gets back into the feline digestive tract where it needs to persist to reproduce. And actually, there's been some recent research to suggest that the protozoan does infect human brains and might have a similar effect on our own brain chemistry. There's some suggestion that people who are essentially addicted to hoarding cats might actually be affected by this organism. And there's some decent evidence to suggest that there are cat hoarders who are not disgusted by or might not even smell cat urine, and the hypothesis is that it's this organism causing those changes. But let me show you another example of a parasite. We're first going to listen to a little clip from my favorite radio show, Radio Lab, and then I'll show you a video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Parasites. Are they evil or are they awesome? Starting with number 1, the parasitic wasp.
There are probably 200,000 species of parasitic wasps out there.
Big wasp, small wasp.
They're generally pretty tiny.
And they go after all sorts of things.
So some will lay them in
Carl's caterpillars, spiders, or the one Carl's going to tell us about.
This particular wasp is called Ampulex compressa,
Goes after
a cockroach.
And for those of you who never thought you'd feel sorry for a cockroach, keep listening.
So what it does is it flies around and it looks for a cockroach. And once it finds that cockroach, it lands.
And then the fight begins. They tumble back and forth, around, until finally the wasp somehow manages to arch its back around the body of the cockroach
And stings it.
right in the belly. The cockroach twitches for a second and then falls.
Boom. The cockroach is paralyzed.
Now the wasp takes its time. It repositions itself, puts its butt up right near the cockroach's head.
And delivers a second sting. The stinger actually sort of threads its way to a particular spot in the brain.
And this does something odd. Moments later,
The cockroach recovers, sort of stands up and can walk again, but
but something is wrong. Very wrong.
it just stands there.
Like, I'm awake, but
It can't run away.
can't move.
It has essentially lost its will.
What does that mean?
It's a puppet. Yes, it is a puppet. It's become a zombie, basically. And so now the wasp will literally grab onto the cockroach's antenna and start pulling on it.
How does it grab? With what does it grab?
I believe with its mouth,
Imagine a tiny wasp guiding a cockroach across the desert floor.
like a dog on a leash.
And so it leads it down, down, down.
Down into a little burrow it's made. And the cockroach says, okay, wherever you want to go.
Then, once the wasp has the roach in the burrow,
It lays its eggs on the underside of the cockroach.
so now you've got this drugged roach sitting on top of some wasp eggs. And then the wasp
Goes out and it seals the burrow.
It buries the cockroach alive?
Well, it's
Or it
it's
just
in
puts him in a cell?
it's in a little chamber.
A little
I mean,
chamber.
it doesn't want to kill the cockroach because this cockroach is going to feed its
young.
young, yeah. So then the eggs hatch, and then they drill inside the cockroach, which is still just sitting there.
How's it staying alive at this point?
Well, parasites are very careful. You know, they won't eat vital organs that would kill it.
Instead, Carl says, they just feast on the extra stuff.
There's a lot of stuff inside of a cockroach, a lot of fluid just floating around
Bits of Wonder Bread, essence of skin, old hair.
that you can just feed on, and the host stays alive.
Wow. And then what happens?
Eventually, the little baby wasp larva grows up inside the cockroach.
And develops into an adult.
And then one day,
The wasp eats its way up a little hole out of the cockroach's body, shakes off its wings, and flies off.
And then the roach dies.
Then the roach dies.
And only then.
Yeah.
That, to me, sounds like the purest description in nature of evil that I can imagine. Wouldn't you agree?
Well,
So I just had to play you that radio clip because I think it's amazingly done. But now I'm going to actually show you some footage because how can you not watch footage of that relationship? And while we're watching this, and as I give a little narration, think about the evolutionary relationship that these wasps have become dependent on this host, the cockroach, for their very reproduction. So we'll touch a lot more on those sorts of concepts when we get to evolution. But here's the video. So here we have our cockroach, right? And here's that great battle they described. And this is where the wasp is stinging to anesthetize the cockroach. And now it's actually performing brain surgery, right? It's actually creating a zombie cockroach. And here you can see now the wasp has grabbed onto the antennae, or is trying to grab onto the antennae, and it'll lead the cockroach, right? So that brain surgery has essentially destroyed the cockroach's free will, so that the wasp can drag it wherever it wants. Of course, this is in a lab, not in the wild, but there is a great variety of wasps that do this sort of parasitism with various organisms. So this jeweled wasp here, you can see, is now laying its larvae, egg, on the bottom of the cockroach, which will then hatch into a larvae. And it is now bearing the cockroach, right, to seal it in its little chamber there. And now in a minute we'll actually watch that larvae increase in size and begin feasting on the cockroach's body. You can see it get bigger and bigger, and as I described in that clip, it's avoiding vital organs as to preserve the life of the cockroach for as long as possible so that it can feed on it as long as possible. And eventually, you can see how quite large they get, it'll actually burst free of the cockroach, and now you have a brand new jeweled wasp that can continue that relationship. So pretty startling. So here's another one. You look at this picture, right? What do you see? I hope many of you are seeing berries, and then you see this insect here, right? This is an ant. And you'll notice the coloration on this ant is very similar in shape and size, I should say, to the berry. It wasn't always this way. In fact, that used to be a black ant. Another nematode has caused physiological changes in the ant. And you might guess why, right? That's so that the ant's butt looks much more like a berry. And it actually causes behavioral changes too. The ants will climb essentially to the highest thing they can get and start waving their butts around. And I hope that you might guess now that that is to attract birds. So this nematode wants to reproduce in bird digestive tracts. And that way the nematode can be spread far and wide, right? Pretty amazing relationship. So one thing I want you to think about is we are going to spend a lot of time in ecology looking at predator-prey relationships, and I hope that you'll understand the great value of predators to ecosystems. I want you to pose this question, or I'm posing this question to you. Could there be a similar benefit to parasites in ecosystems? So think about that, and we'll discuss that at some point in the course. Now, I'm going to run through a couple quick examples just to quickly test you. This is obviously of practice for standardized testing, but here we have a clownfish, right? And they have a relationship with sea anemones. The sea anemones capture their prey by paralyzing them with their tentacles. However, the clownfish has that mucus that allows them to live within the tentacles without being harmed on it. So this clownfish gets protection, right? And there's no, at least in my description here, no benefit provided to the sea anemone. So what would you describe that as? Parasitism, mutualism, or commensalism? So I'm hoping that you're saying commensalism, right? It's a one-way benefit to the clownfish. In actuality, many people believe the clownfish actually does provide a benefit to the sea anemone by fighting off potential predators and providing some cleaning services. In which case, if that's true, it's mutualism, right? Because they are both benefiting. Here's another one. The birds on this picture are munching away on the parasitic insects that live on the rhino. So what is that a benefit, or what is that an example of? Mutualism, right? Because they both benefit. Okay. Here we have lampreys. These are these eel-like organisms. They're attached to this fish. They have very primitive digestive systems, so they actually feed on other organisms' bodily fluids. So what symbiotic relationship would you call this? I hope you're saying parasitism, right? One is benefited, the other is actually harmed, right? Here's our last example. We got these orchids way up in this tree. They grow up high. These orchids get more sunlight, more water than those on the ground, but the tree is unaffected, right? Isn't hurt or isn't harmed or isn't benefited by the orchids. So what would you call that? I hope you'd call that commensalism, right? Okay. All right, the last concept I want to talk about is obligate symbiotes. And these are symbiotes that are obligated to share that relationship, so it's not optional. My favorite example is ruminants. You might have heard of cows, pigs, sheep, reindeer, elk, and how they have this pretty unique ability to eat grass, right? Grass in particular is made up of cellulose, which we can't break down. So we, dogs, other sorts of vertebrates can't break down that material. We don't have the right enzymes for it. So it takes a very special relationship that the ruminants have formed with microorganisms. And these are bacteria, this is yeast, this is protozoa, this is fungus. And they live within a special chamber within their stomachs. And you've probably heard that cows have multi-chambered stomachs. And you can see in this diagram the rumen, and that's essentially the habitat that these vertebrates create for their microflora, that in exchange for providing them foodstuffs, collecting foodstuffs, providing warmth and moisture and protection, they get the process of breaking down cellulose and some other things, allowing these vertebrates to eat grass, right, which greatly opens up their ability to move from area to area, to live in unique places and survive on what can be a very abundant food source. So it's a pretty fascinating relationship, and it's estimated that in about 1 millimeter of rumen there are 10 to 50 billion bacteria, 1 million protozoa, and several yeast and fungi species. So it's pretty amazing, right? So that's the end of our vodcast on symbiosis, and I hope you found it useful.